You're watching the Ideas Factory at the ORF online. With me is Professor Pant. We will look at all that was important in your world during the past week. India has assumed presidency of the G20 on the 1st of December, and the first Sherpa meet of the G20 representatives of the leaders is taking place here in India in the city of Udaipur. We will look at that, how India is placed in a very unique position as it assumes the presidency of the G20. But other than that, let's look at China. China, where a lot of protests are taking place, and it is unusual that we see these kind of protests on the streets in China. So we will look at that. We will look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, to all that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. To begin with, let's look at China. Harsh, during the past week, we have seen a lot of protests, a lot of slogans being raised against Xi Jinping on the streets of China, in Beijing, in Shanghai. And this was unusual. I mean, after the Tiananmen Square protests, probably there have been protests, but not at this scale. Or we don't know whether it was hyped by the Western media, but at least pictures came out, visuals came out, and there were slogans like "Down with Xi Jinping." There were various kind of protests that one could see. This was against the very strict COVID curbs, of course. But was it? It also spread to the universities. There were students involved. Can we see this as a warning to Xi Jinping, but at a time when he's assumed the presidency for the third time, and is more in control of things than ever before? But you see this as a warning to his authority? Do you see this as also a discontent within the Communist Party?
Thanks, Naghma. I think these protests have been quite unprecedented. Many people don't realize that protests are actually quite common in China, but those protests generally tend to be very localized. They tend to be on local issues against local administrations in various parts of the country, often disjointed. But these protests have been unique because they have been more coordinated. There is a sense, there is a common challenge that everyone seems to be facing, and this is the COVID challenge, the zero COVID policy and its aftermath. So in some ways, people are feeling, have similar problems, similar challenges across the country. And I think that was reflected in some of these outbursts, in some of these protests. And especially in particular, I think the students' communities, university students came out. And, whether you believe them or not, there was certainly a discontent about zero COVID. There is a discontent about the way Chinese administration has handled it now for the last 2.5 years, almost. People being put under extremely difficult circumstances. And I think they're also recognized that the world is moving on while China is not. So I think that also creates pressure about the economic future, about their own livelihoods, about their own day-to-day workings. And I think that almost has become a pressure cooker sort of a situation for many Chinese. And so I think there is a lot of steam is being went out. I don't think it's quite likely that Xi Jinping would go anywhere because of these protests. But certainly, I think what it underscores is that when you have a system which is insulated from the demands of the people, then at any moment it can burst out like this, and the administration will have to be extremely nimble in responding to it. And already we are seeing changes. We are seeing an acknowledgement that something has gone wrong, that things need to change. And I think in a statement that was quoted by a European official saying that Chinese officials are telling them that that people are angry, people are dissatisfied, and they need to change their policies. And they will change their policies because they know that they have to adapt to what people are telling them. But I think it's a broader spectrum of issues that one has to underscore, that for all that Xi Jinping represents, the power, the centralization, many of his, and I think most of his decisions have been rather poorly received. If you look at foreign policy, he has almost isolated China. Single-handedly, he managed to make China the bad guy around the world, across a range of countries. And now domestically, people are also dissatisfied with the way the economic environment is shaping up and with the way his zero COVID policy has emerged. So certainly not a very good a very good start to an almost historic third term, an unprecedented third term that he has gained. But I think it should be a reminder of what centralization, overt centralization, extreme centralization can do to policy making.
It could be his biggest challenge after assuming presidency for a third time, a record third time. And at the time when he felt he was all powerful, we also hear a couple of analysts talk about the discontent within the Communist Party, which is what is also reflecting, on the streets, maybe, or in the kind of protest that we saw on the streets. And that could be his biggest challenge, to control these. And he may not go anywhere soon, but does it undermine his authority? Does it make the situation difficult for him there?
Well, it does make the situation difficult for him, and I think it does, make it very clear that he, despite his centralization of powers, is leading a country where multiple fault lines are coming together. Whether it is the problem of economy, whether it is a problem of pandemic, whether it is a problem of inequalities across regions, and as you point out, dissatisfaction within the party about the trajectory that the party has taken. Let us remember that before him, there used to be more collegial system of governance, where different groups used to work together, balancing each other out, but also giving a semblance of stability to the Communist Party hierarchy. Today, he has become the face of the party. So ultimately, if he's willing to take on the successes of China on his shoulders, he'll also have to bear the responsibility for the failures. And that's the challenge that he faces, because he can't dissociate himself from his zero COVID policy, which just a few weeks back, he told how wonderful it is doing to the 20th Party Congress. And now suddenly it seems not to be doing so well. So clearly, I think he's now under pressure. And therefore, he's also asking the local administration now to take a lot of the blame. So the argument is that this is all about local administrations, their inability to be flexible, their inability to manage people's circumstances in a way that perhaps allows them greater flexibility. But ultimately, as far as people are concerned, and that's what we heard briefly, if at all, this sense that down with Xi Jinping, the sense that ultimately everything is about Xi Jinping in China today. And he can't really rule himself out from these murmurings of discontent. And ultimately, that is going to be his biggest challenge, both as Communist Party tries to find an alternative to the centralized decision-making process that he has created, and the people on the streets express their discontent openly.
Absolutely. Like you said, if he takes the credit for everything that happens in China, he has to take the blame or the responsibility too for all that goes wrong. And there are a couple of things that are creating trouble back domestically in China. There is a bad economy to deal with. There is discontent amongst the people. We're also hearing that China is finding it very difficult to vaccinate its elderly. China has refused Western vaccines. Of course, that's a different matter altogether. But China is also, a couple of factories are moving out of China, like Apple has planned to move out of China probably, because of all the protests that it saw. But at the same time, China does not fail to interfere in areas which does not really concern it directly. For example, the India-US military exercise that was taking place in Oli. And China raised objections and said that this poses a great threat to us. But at the same time, China convenes gathering of the Indian Ocean nations, and it invites about 19 countries, all those countries which are part of the Indian Ocean region. India, being a very integral part of the Indian Ocean region, was probably the lone absentee. How do we see this?
Well, I think this has been quite an interesting gathering, and one must acknowledge that there have been a lot of back and forth between who is coming, who has joined, who did not join. But clearly, India was neither invited nor it participated in its official capacity. But I think it tells you something, which is that China's expanse of interest is quite wide today, and Indian Ocean in particular is important for China today as it looks at its own growing profile in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, and Indian Ocean in particular is jarring, because Indian Ocean is one geography where India's geographical advantages give India some natural, a heft, and therefore for China to push back in the Indian Ocean is very, very important to demonstrate to the world that Indian Ocean is also an area where it can exert influence, like other parts of the world. And Indian Ocean is also one area where China feels its strategic interests lie, given the trade routes, given the strategic frontiers that are expanding for China. So certainly, I think one has to look at this as part of competitive institution building in the Indian Ocean region. China's attempt to frame some kind of a platform, some kind of an institutional architecture, but also pointedly not bringing India into the fold, or not keeping India into the loop. Now it has its, of course, China is a very important part of the region today. It is a very important partner to most Indian Ocean countries. So it will try to push its weight across the region. But I think the challenge is fundamentally about India, that in the Indian Ocean, if you are trying to create something, if you are trying to conceive something, you really cannot ignore India. Without India, there is not going to be any credible institutional architecture that one can create. Without India, you really cannot map out the challenges in the region, and therefore work with other countries. And India has the first mover advantage in the region, with platforms like IORA, etc., where India has been galvanizing the region towards meeting common challenges. So India is already out there. China's attempt, how successful it will be, remains to be seen. But what China is doing is putting India on notice that it is willing to shape the regional architecture, even in the Indian Ocean. And its presence in the Indian Ocean is something that one has to take for granted now.
China is stepping up its diplomacy clearly in the Indian Ocean region. And how do we see the intent of keeping India out, considering India, because of its geographical position, has a natural heft in the region, but the intent to keep India out, and at the same time complaining about every, like the military exercise, the joint military exercise that India and the US armies were doing in Oli?
Yes, I think that is something that perhaps that worries China, and I think that was that complaint in that complaint was reflected the underlying worry that India and the US and India and the West particularly are now working much more cohesively together than they were before. And to be very honest, a lot of the blame has to be laid at China's doorstep itself. Had China played its cards better, perhaps this situation would not have arisen. But clearly for India, having any other country, giving any other country a veto over what it does with its like-minded partners is not really an option. And I don't think China has any credible right to make that kind of an argument. India will work with its partners the way it deems fit, and India is not doing anything that India is not doing with many other partners in many other geographies. Military exercises these days are common part of defense diplomacy. They are standard elements of defense diplomacy, and India has been engaged in an extensive array of defense diplomatic engagements. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the geography in which Indo-US exercises were taking place were very close to the Chinese border. But that is what it is. I think ultimately, if India has to work with its like-minded partners in meeting the challenges, then those challenges will have to be defined by the geographical boundaries they represent. And in this particular case, or in wider case, in the wider ambit of India's defense engagements elsewhere also, India does not take these decisions or pursue these choices based on what other parties or third countries are thinking about it. It's primarily determined by its own interests and by its own strategic imperatives, and that's what it was doing. What it was doing with the Americans as well.
Of course, what we see is how China has basically different standards when it comes to what China is pursuing, the aggressive policy and what it expects its neighbors to do. We're talking of India's presidency at the G-22, Harsh, but India has assumed this presidency at a time which is where the world is very, very divided. For example, I mean, the main thing is, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war. So before we look at the challenges and the unique position that India is in as far as the presidency is concerned and these turbulent times, what really is happening with on the Russia-Ukraine front? Do you see any kind of progress there?
Yes, I think very interesting developments that have happened recently, although not in any way, uh, leading us to believe that anything substantive is in the offing. But during the French president's visit to Washington, U.S. President Biden openly talked about his willingness to talk to the Russian president, but he added a caveat that if Mr. Putin is interested in peace. And I think the response from Russia was that we are interested only if the US and the West accept some of our demands, and one of the demands being to recognize the areas that they have annexed. That Moscow has annexed, in Ukraine. Now, clearly, that is not a demand that the Western countries are going to agree to, particularly as it involves Ukraine. And I think one of the common refrains that we have heard is that it will be Ukraine's decision as to what happens between Russia and the West. Ultimately, if Ukraine decides that they want to pursue peace, it's their decision, and the terms that will be decided by the Ukrainians themselves. And Ukrainians at this point are not interested in pulling back, because they have the advantage on the battlefield. It seems that some of the ground that the Russians have been losing the ground on the battlefield. So Russians are now more interested, or their war strategies aimed at targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, energy grids in particular, to ensure that this winter Ukrainians have a very, very difficult time, and that would push them into finding a solution to the problem. But it's unlikely in the short term to yield any results, and Ukrainians are not going to relent, and therefore Russians are not going to relent, and as a result, what we will find is that this grinding war will continue through the winter. And as they regroup, as the two sides resupply and enhance their logistics, perhaps for a counter-offensive in the spring. So I don't see a possibility that any dramatic a shift is going to happen where the two antagonists are going to come to the negotiating table. And therefore, while there is a desire on the part of many Western countries, we have seen statements from France, from the US, from Germany, all indicating that a diplomatic solution is needed. But I don't think they have the terms yet on which this diplomatic solution can be found.
So no diplomatic solution really is in the offing for now, nothing substantive, and it's going to be a very difficult winter for the Ukrainians, of course, also for a large part of Europe. In these turbulent times and the way the world is polarized, India assumes the presidency of G-20. We know that the first Sherpa meeting is taking place in Udaipur, where actually the agenda, the broad outline, the priorities will be set for the upcoming meetings during the course of the year. I mean, there are talks on social development goals. Those need to be adopted. So India is placed in a very unique situation, and also a lot of challenges going forward.
Yes, I think, again, India's position remains very unique, and we have heard statements from various quarters. The Germans, the French, the Americans, even the Russians have spoken out and said that, look, we really look forward to India's presidency, because India remains one of the few countries that can extend a hand to multiple stakeholders at a time of this extreme polarization in global politics. And so, there is much that is riding on India's leadership at this point.
Yeah.
And that, again, that itself makes it a challenge, because if the expectations are so high, then India's inability to deliver can also be quite problematic. So therefore, for India, this is a moment to ensure that it brings all these stakeholders together. But also, I think as Indian policymakers have repeatedly outlined, that they would want their presidency to be a platform where the voice of the global South becomes more prominent in global politics. Whichever way you look at it, whether it is the COVID crisis, economic deceleration, Ukraine crisis, the failure of global multilateralism. It's the most vulnerable countries, the weakest countries, the poorest countries that bear the brunt of most of these problems. So I think becoming a voice of the global south is India's way to bring a new kind of leadership on the global stage at a time when great power politics is sharpening, and where the various parts of the of globe, especially the major powers, are increasingly unwilling to work together. So how India brings these competing priorities together, how India brings multiple stakeholders together, will be a big test of India's leadership. And India seems to be signaling that it is ready to lead at this difficult juncture. We'll see what happens.
Of course, India needs to become the voice of the global south, and also it has to bring together a lot of disagreeing major powers. Before we close this episode, a very quick comment, Harsh, on the Counterterror conference, the No Money for Terror conference that took place here in Delhi, and what were some of the new strategies that came out on containing global terror?
I think for India, this was an important conference because, as we know, and as we have been discussing over the last several weeks, there are so many challenges in the world today that terrorism, that after 9/11 looked to be the most important global issue, suddenly finds itself outdated and marginalized. But for a country like India, that's not really an option. India has to bring this issue back to the global agenda time and time again, because India is at the front line in some ways, of this major problem. And so I think India is again making a case that it is willing to lead on this issue. It is willing to bring various countries together, and I think India's proposal to set up a platform in Delhi that can monitor the financial flows to terror groups is something that has generated a lot of excitement, because in a lot of world capitals there is no appetite anymore to proactively take up this issue. So the more India leads on this issue, the better it is for Indian interests. But I think it is also better for global governance, which at this particular point in time finds where the issue of terrorism at this particular point in time finds very little resonance. And for India, that's not really an option. So I think how India galvanizes the international community. We got a glimpse of this at this conference, and hopefully India will continue to place this issue on the global agenda, and will continue to take this conversation forward. That was, I think, in some ways, the most important takeaway from this conference.
Yes, being in the position that India is also geographically, it's imperative that India keeps bringing this issue with center stage, the issue of terrorism, and the thrust this time also was on no money for terror, no funding of terror. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that analysis and your comments. And that's it from us on this episode of The Ideas Factory. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.